You're lying in bed right now, or maybe you will be tonight. The room is warm, around 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius. The sheets are heavy, perhaps a duvet designed to trap the warmth your body produces and hold it close to your skin. A heater hums in the corner, or warm air moves quietly through vents in the walls, and your body does something you barely think about. It keeps your core temperature remarkably stable throughout the night. Your blood continues circulating. Your metabolism keeps producing heat. Your nervous system constantly adjusts blood flow, breathing, and energy use without you consciously doing anything. You sleep. 8 hours, perhaps. And when you wake up, you probably won't remember a single moment when you had to think about staying warm. Now rewind roughly 1,200 years. You're lying on a raised wooden sleeping platform inside a Viking-age longhouse somewhere in Scandinavia. Outside, winter has settled over the landscape. The nights are long, the ground is frozen, cold air presses against the walls of the building, and there is no central heating waiting behind the walls. No thermostat, no electric blanket, no modern insulation, no insulated sleeping bag. There is a fire burning somewhere inside the longhouse, but it cannot simply be kept roaring all night without producing enormous amounts of smoke and consuming valuable fuel. So eventually, the flames become smaller, and the temperature inside begins to fall. Yet you still have to sleep. Your body needs sleep, just as much as yours does today. It needs time to recover, process memories, regulate hormones, and repair itself. But sleep creates a strange problem. When you're awake and cold, you can move. You can walk closer to the fire. You can add another layer of clothing. You can gather more wood. You can eat.
When you're asleep, you can't consciously do any of those things. So how did people living in Viking-age Scandinavia make it through winter nights? The answer wasn't one secret invention. It was a system. Their bodies generated heat. Their clothing trapped it. Their buildings reduced heat loss. Their bedding created insulating layers. Their fires provided warmth. And the people themselves became part of the heating system.
To understand how this worked, we first need to understand something surprisingly simple. Your body is constantly producing heat. Even when you're lying completely still, your cells are using energy. A resting adult produces roughly the heat equivalent of a small light bulb, around 70 to 100 watts, depending on body size and activity. That heat doesn't disappear. Some of it warms the air around you, some is absorbed by your clothing and bedding, and some is lost to the surrounding environment. When the environment becomes colder, your body starts fighting back. Blood vessels near the skin constrict, reducing heat loss from the body's surface. Your metabolism can increase. And if you become cold enough, your muscles begin producing additional heat through shivering. None of this requires conscious thought. Your nervous system handles it automatically. The people living in Viking-age Scandinavia had the same basic biological machinery, but biology alone wasn't enough. The real battle was controlling how quickly that heat escaped. And this is where their materials became extremely important. Wool was one of their most valuable tools. Wool doesn't create heat. It does something almost as important. It traps air. The structure of wool fibers allows pockets of relatively still air to remain inside the material. Those trapped air spaces make it harder for heat to move away from the body. And wool has another advantage. It can retain much of its insulating ability even when it becomes somewhat damp, although wet clothing is still dangerous in cold conditions. For people living in a cold climate, that mattered enormously. Instead of relying on one extremely thick garment, people could use layers. A linen garment could sit closer to the body. Wool could provide additional insulation. A cloak could be added when temperatures dropped, and fur could provide another layer between the body and the outside environment. The exact clothing worn by Viking-age people varied enormously, depending on region, wealth, occupation, and season. There was no single standard Viking winter outfit, but the principle was universal. Trap warm air, reduce wind, keep moisture away from the skin, and create as many barriers as possible between the body and the outside environment. Then came the bedding. This may have been even more important than what you wore while walking around during the day. When you're awake, you're constantly generating heat through movement. When you're sleeping, you become much more dependent on your surroundings, so insulating the space immediately around your body becomes critical. Animal skins, furs, woven textiles, wool, blankets, and other materials could all be used to create insulating layers. A fur or thick textile covering doesn't need to make heat, it simply needs to slow the rate at which your heat escapes. Think of it like building a wall around the fire. The fire is your body. The bedding is the wall. The better the insulation, the longer that warmth remains concentrated around you. And Viking-age houses were designed with the same basic principle in mind. The longhouse wasn't simply a place to live. It was a system for dealing with the environment. Many Viking-age longhouses were large communal buildings with a central area where fire could provide heat and light. The exact layout varied greatly, but keeping people, animals, cooking, and heat-producing activities within a shared structure could make the indoor environment more manageable during winter. The fire was crucial, but it wasn't just about creating a huge flame. Fuel had to be collected, smoke had to be managed, and ventilation had to be maintained. A completely sealed building wasn't the answer. Too little ventilation could allow smoke and dangerous gases to accumulate. So the building had to balance two competing needs: keep enough heat inside, let enough smoke and stale air escape. This is one reason Viking-age architecture should not be imagined as a perfectly sealed modern house. It was a compromise. Every opening allowed some heat to escape, but every opening also allowed fresh air inside, and that balance mattered. The same principle applied to the size of the living space. A smaller space is generally easier to warm than a larger one. And inside a communal longhouse, people themselves became another source of heat. 30 people do not just occupy a building. 30 people also produce body heat. Each person might only contribute around the heat output of a small light bulb while resting, but add dozens of people together, along with a fire and other heat sources, and the total energy being released into the building becomes significant. This doesn't mean Vikings deliberately designed every longhouse as a giant human radiator, but communal living had an unavoidable thermal advantage. There were more warm bodies sharing the same indoor environment. And that brings us to one of the simplest technologies humans have ever used against cold: huddling. You can see it across the animal kingdom. Animals instinctively reduce exposed surface area and gather together when temperatures fall. Humans do the same thing. Two people under the same blanket don't necessarily lose heat independently. Their bodies warm the air trapped between them and reduce the amount of exposed surface area. Add additional layers of insulation around them, and a small, warm microenvironment develops. For Viking-age families or groups sharing sleeping spaces, close sleeping arrangements could therefore provide a practical advantage during cold nights. But there is an important distinction. We shouldn't imagine every Viking sleeping in a giant pile of people every night. Sleeping arrangements varied. Families had different living situations. Longhouses differed from one another. Wealthier households could have had better bedding and more private spaces. Others may have lived in much harsher conditions. There was no single Viking sleeping arrangement, but wherever people shared a confined space, their combined body heat inevitably contributed to the warmth of that space. And then there was food. Cold environments increased the demands placed on the body. Physical work generates heat, and maintaining body temperature requires energy. For people who spent their days farming, hunting, traveling, rowing, building, and fighting, food wasn't just about avoiding hunger, it was fuel. Fat and carbohydrates could provide large amounts of energy. Protein supported the body. And during winter, stored food became especially important because agricultural production was limited. This doesn't mean every Viking ate some precise number of calories every day. Their diets varied enormously. But one thing is certain: a person living an active life in a cold environment needs energy. And without enough food, the body's ability to maintain itself becomes increasingly limited. So staying warm wasn't just an architectural problem. It was also a food storage problem, a fuel problem, a clothing problem, and a biological problem. Everything was connected. Now imagine the longhouse. The fire has burned down. The wind is pressing against the walls. Outside, the temperature is far below what your modern bedroom feels like. You pull a heavy wool covering over your body. Another layer goes over it. Perhaps a fur is added on top. Your body is producing heat. The bedding slows its escape. The wooden structure blocks much of the wind. The fire has already warmed the interior, and dozens of other people may be sleeping somewhere nearby. None of these things is miraculous. That's the point. The Vikings didn't need one extraordinary invention. They combined dozens of ordinary solutions, and those solutions reinforce one another. A cloak by itself isn't enough. A fire by itself isn't enough. A wooden house by itself isn't enough. A blanket by itself isn't enough. But combine insulation, shelter, fire, food, clothing, and human body heat, and the problem becomes much more manageable. There is another important detail modern people sometimes overlook. Scandinavia is cold. But Viking-age Scandinavia was not one giant frozen wasteland. Climate varied dramatically by location. Coastal regions could have relatively moderate winter temperatures compared with inland areas. Southern Scandinavia was different from northern Scandinavia, and conditions changed from one year to another. So we should be careful with the popular image of Vikings routinely sleeping in temperatures of minus 30 degrees Celsius inside every longhouse. That would be an exaggeration. Many Viking communities experienced serious winter cold, but the exact conditions depended heavily on where they lived. And that's actually what makes their survival more impressive. They didn't need to conquer some imaginary permanent Arctic environment. They needed to adapt to the real seasonal climate around them. They learned where to build, how to build, what materials to use, how much fuel to gather, what food to preserve, what to wear, and how to organize their lives around the seasons. Their greatest advantage wasn't one piece of technology, it was accumulated knowledge. Generation after generation learned which materials worked, which buildings stayed warmer, which clothing became dangerous when wet, how much fuel a household needed, how to store food before winter, and how to respond when conditions became worse than expected. We don't survive harsh environments by becoming physically invincible. We survive by adapting the environment around ourselves. The Vikings couldn't stop winter, so they slowed the loss of heat. They built shelters, gathered fuel, layered textiles, and preserved food. When all those solutions worked together, the human body endured. Not comfortably, and certainly not without suffering, but alive. Viking life was never a story of effortless survival. People grew numb, suffered frostbite, and died from exposure. Their technology didn't make them immune. It simply improved their odds. And that is the defining difference between their world and ours. Tonight, you will climb into bed without giving it a second thought. If the room is cold, you will simply adjust the thermostat. You won't have to chop firewood or repair drafty walls before nightfall. You won't need to calculate how much heat your family can produce. For you, warmth is a button. For a Viking, warmth was an entire living system, a system forged from fire, timber, wool, biology, and human cooperation. Yet tonight, your body relies on that exact same ancient machinery. Your metabolism still produces the steady heat of a small flame. Your blood vessels still narrow to guard your vital core. Your muscles still shiver when the temperature drops. You still pull the blankets tight when the air turns sharp. The tools around us have evolved beyond recognition. The underlying biological challenge has not changed at all. We remain warm-blooded animals navigating a cold world. The Vikings faced that reality with only the materials at hand. Every winter, they waged that quiet battle against the dark. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but just well enough to make it to spring.